they called her the Shattered Heir. Lady Alara, once the pride of the kingdom of Eridor, was now its most public shame. Before the fall, she had moved through the stone halls of the citadel with a grace that rivaled the deer in the royal forests. Her laughter was said to be the kingdom's favorite music, and her mind, sharp and inquisitive, was a match for any of her father's wisest counselors. She was the future, the promise of a golden age etched in the fine lines of her noble face. But fate, in its cruel and indifferent way, had snapped that promise in two. A spirited stallion, a slippery stone on a rain-slicked path, and a fall that had stolen the life from her legs. Now, she was defined not by her lineage or her intellect, but by the ornate, unmoving chair in which she sat, a throne of polished wood and bitter irony. Her paralysis was a constant, visible reminder of imperfection, a flaw her father, King Theron, could not abide. The day of her final degradation arrived on a wind that smelled of autumn frost and decay. The great hall was filled not with suitors seeking her hand, but with stone-effaced lords and merchants, summoned to witness a king's cruelty masquerading as necessity. King Theron stood before the grand hearth, his face a mask of regal sorrow that fooled no one. He spoke of burdens, of the crown's heavy duties, and of his daughter's tragic state. He called her a treasure he could no longer protect, a jewel whose setting had broken. It was a poet's lie wrapped around a tyrant's truth. He was not relinquishing a treasure, he was discarding a broken tool. He declared that Lady Alara, first of his blood, would be given into the wardship of any man of means who would take her from the castle, relieving the crown of its painful obligation. He did not offer a dowry of land or gold. The prize was simply her, the shattered heir, a living symbol of shame to be carted away like unwanted furniture. A gasp rippled through the assembled crowd, a mixture of shock and pity. Alara sat beside the dais, her hands clenched in the lap of her silk gown, her gaze fixed on the cold floor. The silence that followed the king's proclamation was a heavy shroud, suffocating her, pressing down with the weight of her own worthlessness. In the back of the hall, half hidden in the shadows near the great oaken doors, a man stood whose presence was an anomaly. He was not a lord in velvet nor a merchant in fine wool. His clothes were of simple, durable leather and homespun linen, smudged with the honest grime of his trade. His hands, clasped before him, were large and calloused, a map of hard labor and quiet strength. This was Cailan, the blacksmith. His forge, on the edge of the capital, was known for producing the finest steel in the kingdom, but he rarely came to the citadel. He was there by royal command, to deliver a new set of ceremonial blades. He had intended to leave them with the quartermaster and depart, unseen and unheard. But he had been trapped by the closing of the doors, forced to bear witness to this grotesque spectacle. He was a man marked by his own tragedy, a widower whose heart lived in a quiet winter of grief. His wife, Lyra, had been stolen from him by a fever after giving birth to their son, Finn. The boy, now 6, had not spoken a single word since the day his mother's warmth had left their small cottage. Cailan saw not a broken princess, but a reflection of his own world of loss, a soul drowning in a silence as profound as his son's. As the silence in the hall stretched into an agonizing eternity, something in Cailan shifted. It was not pity, but a deep, resonant anger at the injustice. He saw the king's cold ambition, the calculated cruelty that stripped a woman of her dignity for the sake of appearances. He saw Alara, fragile and yet radiating a core of defiance that was visible only to a man who understood what it meant to hold on when everything else had been taken away. While the lords and merchants shuffled their feet, averting their eyes, Cailan took a step forward. And then another. The sound of his heavy work boots on the polished stone was a stark intrusion, drawing every eye. He walked not to the king, but to the open space before Alara's chair. He did not bow his head. He looked at her first, a glance of profound, unspoken acknowledgement, before turning his gaze to the throne. "Your Majesty," his voice was low and steady, like the deep hum of his bellows. "I have no lands to offer. My coin is spent on iron and coal." The king's lip curled in a sneer. "Then why do you waste the court's time, blacksmith?" Cailan's jaw tightened. "I offer my trade. The finest steel you will ever see. Enough to arm your personal guard. Swords, arrowheads, mail. A year of my forged labor." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a fortune in craft, a substantial offer. All this, Kaelin continued, his voice echoing slightly in the vast hall. In exchange for the honor of taking Lady Elara into my care. The king stared, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity. A common smith. It was the ultimate insult, and yet, the perfect solution. To have his daughter taken in by a man of soot and cinders would cement her fall from grace completely. Done, the king snapped, eager to have the affair finished. Take her. The steel is owed to the crown by the new moon. He turned away, a dismissal that was as sharp and final as a headsman's axe. The transaction was complete. The heir to the throne had been sold for a pile of sharpened metal. The journey from the cold grandeur of the citadel to the humble warmth of the forge was a sensory shock. Elara had lived her entire life surrounded by the scent of beeswax and old tapestries, the whisper of silk on marble, the distant, muted sounds of a court in motion. Now, the air was thick with the tang of coal smoke, the sharp, metallic perfume of hot iron, and the earthy smell of damp ground. Kaelin carried her from the cart to his cottage, his arms a cradle of unexpected strength and gentleness. He moved as if she were made of spun glass, not shattered stone. The cottage was small, nestled beside the large, open-sided structure of the forge itself. Inside, it was spare but immaculately clean. A single main room served as kitchen and living space, dominated by a stone hearth where a small fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the whitewashed walls. He did not take her to the simple cot near the hearth, but through a small doorway into a cozy, enclosed bedroom. The bed was covered with a thick, patched quilt, and a small window looked out onto a patch of winter-bare garden. "This was my room," he said, his voice quiet. "Mine and my wife's. The air is warmer in here. You will be more comfortable." He placed her gently on the edge of the bed, his hands retreating as if he were afraid to presume any further familiarity. He would take the cot outside, he explained, closer to the forge, where he often slept anyway. It was the first selfless act of kindness she had experienced since her world had broken. Days bled into weeks. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself between them. In the mornings, the rhythmic clang of Kaelin's hammer on the anvil became the beat of her new life. It was a sound of purpose, of creation, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of her chambers in the castle. She had expected cruelty, or at best, indifferent neglect. She had braced herself for the life of a burden, a useless mouth to feed. But Kaelin treated her not as a broken object, but as a person. He would bring her meals on a wooden tray he had sanded smooth, a simple stew or a piece of bread with cheese, always placing it within easy reach. He never stared at her useless legs or spoke to her with the saccharine pity she had come to despise. He spoke to her as an equal. It was in the second week that his true motive was revealed. His son, Finn, a small, ghost-like child with eyes that held an ocean of sorrow, would hover in the doorway of her room, watching her with a silent, intense curiosity. One evening, as Kaelin brought her supper, he hesitated at the door. "My lady," he began, the title feeling strange on his lips. I did not take you for myself. It is for my son." He explained how the boy had retreated into a world of silence after his mother's death. "He is bright," Kaelin said, his voice thick with a father's pained love. "But I have nothing to offer his mind. I have only calloused hands and a hammer. You have learning. I had hoped, perhaps you could teach him his letters. Give him something I cannot." Elara looked from the grieving father to the silent child peeking around his legs. For the first time in a year, she felt a flicker not of purpose, but of profound, aching necessity. She was needed. The next day, Kaelin brought her a small, smooth piece of slate and a stick of chalk. She began to teach Finn. His small hand in hers, she guided him through the shapes of letters, her voice, soft at first, growing stronger with each lesson. She was no longer the shattered heir. She was a teacher. The bridge between their two wounded worlds was built of shared stories and quiet vulnerabilities. In the long, dark evenings, with the forge silent and Finn asleep on his small cot, they would talk. The fire in the hearth would cast long shadows, creating an intimacy the brightly lit castle had never allowed. She told him of her life before, of her love for astronomy and political theory, and then, her voice barely a whisper, she spoke of the accident. She confessed her certainty that it had been no accident at all, but the work of a rival duke who saw her progressive ideas as a threat. Her father, prioritizing a political alliance, had dismissed her fears and forbidden any investigation. She had not just lost her mobility, she had been betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. Kaelan listened, his gaze steady, his silence a vessel that could hold the weight of her pain. In return, he opened the locked rooms of his own heart. He spoke of Lyra, of her wild laugh and the way she would bring him wildflowers to put in a jar by the anvil. He described the crushing helplessness of watching her fade, and the echoing silence she had left behind, a silence that had swallowed his son's voice. They were two solitary islands, their shores eroded by grief, who were now discovering a land bridge forming between them in the low tide of a shared evening. They were not noble and commoner. They were simply Alara and Kaelan, two survivors mapping the geography of their scars. The physical world seemed to conspire to bring them closer. A fierce winter storm, a true blizzard, descended upon the capital, burying the world in a thick blanket of white. The wind howled like a starved wolf, rattling the very bones of the small cottage. In the middle of the night, there was a sound like a giant's fist cracking, followed by a splintering crash. A heavy, snow-laden branch from an old oak had smashed through the roof of Ilara's room, bringing a cascade of snow, splintered wood, and freezing air down onto her bed. Kaelan was there in an instant, a silhouette against the raging white outside. Without a word, he swept the heavy quilt around her and lifted her into his arms, carrying her out into the main room as more of the ceiling groaned and gave way. He settled her into a chair by the hearth and piled blankets on her, his hands moving with urgent, protective care. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them inside the small, firelit space of the main room. They were in constant proximity, a world shrunk to the few feet around the fire. He slept on the floor by her chair, a silent guardian. One evening, as the fire burned low, she shivered from a draught. He rose and adjusted her blankets, and his hand brushed against her cheek. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a touch charged with unspoken care, with a deep, burgeoning tenderness that neither of them dared to name. In that moment, surrounded by the storm's fury, they had never felt safer. As the physical storm passed, a social one began to brew. News of their strange arrangement had become fodder for village gossip. The broken princess living with the soot-stained smith. The tale reached the king's ears, twisted and embellished into a story of mockery. He had intended for his daughter to disappear into miserable obscurity, not find a strange sort of peace in a commoner's hovel. It offended his sense of order. His pride was stung. In a fit of cold fury, he levied a new, crippling tax upon Kaelan's forge, a crown levy for special resources, backdated and impossibly high. Bailiffs arrived with the proclamation, their sneering faces a clear message from the king. The tax would ruin him. His work, which had been a source of pride and sustenance, was now a weapon turned against him. The community, once whispering, now grew wary. To associate with Kaelan was to risk the king's displeasure. His customers dwindled, and the warmth of his forge fire seemed to shrink against the growing chill of ostracism. The final confrontation was inevitable. King Theron summoned them back to the citadel. He wanted to see them broken, to witness the failure of their defiant little world. He expected to see Kaelan humbled and begging, and Ilara miserable and defeated. They entered the great hall, the same hall where she had been bartered away. Kaelan did not bow. He stood tall, his hands clean but his face etched with worry. Ilara, seated in the sturdy, finely sanded chair he had built for her, met her father's gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only a calm, unyielding strength he had never seen before. "You wish to see us, father?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying through the hall. He was not her king in that moment, but merely her sire. "I wish to see the end of this farce," Theron spat. "This blacksmith cannot pay the levy. His forge will be forfeit to the crown. You will be sent to the Silent Sisters Abbey, where your shame can be hidden behind stone walls for the rest of your days." He expected tears, please. Instead, Ilara gave a small, sad smile. "You see a farce. I see a man of honor who gave me shelter when my own blood cast me out. You speak of shame, but the only shame in this hall resides upon the throne. The king was speechless, his face purpling with rage. He had orchestrated her humiliation, yet here she was, in peasant's clothes and a wooden chair, more regal than he had ever seen her. They returned to the cottage that night under the heavy sentence of impending ruin. The forge was cold, the fire unlit. The tools lay silent. The king's decree would be enacted in a matter of days. They had nothing left. The world had struck back, and it had defeated them. They sat in the darkness, the only light coming from a single flickering candle. I have failed you. Kaelin's voice was a rough, broken whisper. I could not protect you. He will take you away, and he will destroy this place. He will destroy Finn's home. Despair hung between them, a thick, suffocating fog. Ilara reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, but his hand was trembling. No, she said, her voice fierce with a love that had bloomed in the ashes of her old life. You did not fail. You gave me back my soul. This place, being here with you, with Finn, it is the only true home I have ever known. If they take it, they take everything. Tears tracked paths through the soot on his cheeks. He looked at her, his heart raw and exposed. In that moment of shared desperation, with the world stripped away, there was nothing left but the truth. I love you, Ilara, he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him. I love you, she whispered back, her own tears falling freely. More than my title, more than my name. In the face of absolute ruin, they clung to each other, their love a final, defiant act of rebellion. It was not a union of hope for the future, but a desperate seizing of the present, a confirmation that even if the world took everything, it could not take what they had found in each other. That night, amidst the silent tools of a dying trade, the heir to the throne and the bastard blacksmith sealed their bond, planting the seed of a new, secret lineage, an act not of surrender, but of ultimate, loving defiance. In the bleak dawn that followed their confession, something shifted in Ilara. The despair of the night had been burned away by the raw heat of their love, leaving behind a cold, clear determination. Her father had always underestimated her mind, seeing it as a mere feminine adornment. Now, she would wield it as a weapon. She spent the entire day questioning Kaelin, not about his fears, but about the intricate details of his trade, his ledgers, and the old guild laws. Buried in her memory, in the lessons from a royal tutor long since dismissed, was a detail about the kingdom's founding charter. She sent Kaelin to the village priest, an old, kind man who had always respected the blacksmith's quiet integrity. The priest, wary of the king but a staunch believer in justice, possessed one of the few written copies of the ancient laws. Kaelin returned with a scroll of yellowed parchment. Ilara spent hours poring over the archaic text, her finger tracing the faded ink. And then she found it. A clause, deep within the Charter of Rights for the artisan guilds, any craftsman who provides a unique and invaluable service to the crown, a service of such singular importance that it safeguards the honor or person of the royal blood, shall be exempt from all special levies and taxes thereon. His workshop declared a ward of the kingdom itself. Her strategy was audacious. Kaelin had not bought her. The king, in his haste to be rid of her, had never formalized the transaction as a sale. Kaelin's offer of steel had not been payment, but a pledge. He had, in effect, performed an invaluable service, the rescue and protection of a member of the royal family when the crown itself had forsaken its duty. The steel was merely a token of his good faith. She explained the plan to Kaelin, whose eyes slowly widened in understanding and awe. The first test came when the king's bailiffs arrived to seize the forge. They were met not by a defeated smith, but by a silent wall of villagers. The priest stood at the front, his arms crossed. "This man is a pillar of our community," the priest announced, his voice firm. "And he is under the protection of the kingdom's oldest laws. You will not touch his forge." The farmers Kaelin had helped, the mothers whose pots he had mended, the stable hands whose tools he had sharpened, they all stood with him. They had been swayed not by a call to rebellion, but by witnessing a simple, profound integrity that the king so clearly lacked. The bailiffs, faced with a peaceful but unmovable crowd and the invocation of ancient law, were forced to retreat. Ilara demanded a formal hearing before the royal council, a right of her birth that even her father could not deny. Once again, she was in the Great Hall, but this time, she was not the object of shame, she was the plaintiff. She sat before the council of grey-bearded lords, Kaelin standing steadfastly behind her chair. With cold, precise logic, she laid out her case. She presented the charter, read the clause aloud, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned the court into silence. King Theron, she said, turning her chair to face her father directly, did not sell me. He abdicated his sacred duty of protection. Kaelin, the blacksmith, stepped into that void. He protected the honor and the very life of the king's own daughter. There can be no service more invaluable. By the laws that founded this kingdom, his forge is exempt. The Levi is illegal. She laid the scroll on the table before the High Chancellor. It was a masterfully crafted legal argument, turning her father's own cruelty and arrogance against him. He had cast her out as a burden, and in doing so, had inadvertently granted her protector an unassailable legal shield. The lords of the council, men who valued tradition and law above all else, murmured amongst themselves. They saw the truth in her words and the trap she had laid. To rule against her would be to invalidate the very charter that gave them their power. The council ruled in her favor. King Theron was publicly and legally checkmated, defeated not by an army or a conspiracy, but by the superior intellect of the daughter he had despised and discarded. His power did not crumble in a day, but the foundation was irrevocably cracked. He was exposed as a man who would bend the law for personal spite, a tyrant ruled by vanity. He was diminished, a hollow crown on a hollow man, left to rage in the cold halls of his castle while his daughter returned to her humble kingdom of iron and love. They returned to the forge not in triumph, but in quiet relief. Their victory was not in defeating the king, but in earning the right to their own small, peaceful life. The forge fire was rekindled, and the sound of Kaelin's hammer once again rang through the village, a rhythm of resilience, a heartbeat of a family reforged in the fires of adversity. Months later, as the first green shoots of spring pushed through the thawed earth, Ilara gave birth to a son. He was a healthy, beautiful boy with his mother's thoughtful eyes and a strong grip that promised his father's strength. Lying in the bed that had once been a symbol of her new, lower station, now a sanctuary of her happiness, she held her child to her breast. Kaelin sat beside her, his large, rough hand gently stroking the baby's head, his face a portrait of such profound joy it seemed to erase all the years of grief. At that moment, little Finn, who had been watching from the doorway, walked slowly into the room. He had observed the entire saga, the arrival of the sad lady, the growing warmth between her and his father, the fight for their home, and now, the arrival of this new life. He looked at the baby, then at his father's joyous face, and then at Ilara. He reached out a small hand and hesitantly touched her arm. She smiled at him, her heart overflowing. He opened his mouth, and for the first time in years, a sound came out, a word spoken with the clear, pure tone of a bell, a word that healed a family and sealed a dynasty. "Mama," he whispered. And so, the hidden bloodline began. It was not a lineage of kings and queens, chronicled in gilded books and proclaimed by trumpets. It was a secret history, whispered in the quiet moments between a hammer's fall and a baby's cry. It was the legacy of a shattered heir who found her wholeness not in a crown, but in a craftsman's love, and of a bastard blacksmith whose honor proved more royal than any king. Their kingdom was not one of land and armies, but one built on a foundation of courage, forged in the fires of injustice, and cemented by a love that could mend any broken thing. True nobility, they had learned, is not a thing you are born with. It is a thing you build. It is the integrity of a spirit that refuses to be broken, and the dignity of a heart that dares to love against all odds. Their descendants would not sit on thrones, but they would carry within them the strength of steel and the quiet wisdom of a queen who chose a forge over a palace, a legacy of true worth that would endure for generations, a silent, noble secret hidden in plain sight.